Okay, so we're diving deep today into the life of Steve Jobs.
Yeah, we are.
And, I was just thinking about, like, just the iconic iPhone launch back in January of '84.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just picturing that, kind of this relatively unknown guy.
Right.
He's holding up this, like, really unassuming piece of tech, and then the lights go down and you hear, "Hello, I'm Macintosh."
Yeah.
Like,
That's a moment.
it's so simple, but it's so impactful, And it really all boils down to the vision of Steve Jobs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, that was a moment that really changed everything.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at all the research you've done, it's like it wasn't an overnight success.
Right.
Like this was the culmination of just this fascinating, sometimes really complex life.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about someone who was born in 1955, adopted as a baby.
Yeah.
Went on to co-found, arguably one of the most influential companies in history.
Yeah.
Was pushed out of that company and then orchestrated one of the most remarkable comebacks
It's crazy
that you could ever imagine. And ultimately just left this profound and lasting legacy. I mean, it's
incredible.
It's an incredible story.
So really what we're trying to do here today is not just rehash the whole Apple story. Like, everyone knows Apple, right?
Yeah.
What we're trying to understand is the man himself.
Exactly.
Like, what were the key experiences that made him?
Yeah, like what shaped him, what made him tick.
Yeah, this guy who could not only envision the future, but in many ways create it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so fascinating about Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
It's like trying to understand the underlying code.
Right.
The formative experiences that contributed to that unique operating system that was Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Right.
Like what made him him.
Exactly.
So let's start at the very beginning.
Okay.
So according to all the stuff you sent over, Stephen Paul Jobs was born on February 24, 1955.
When?
In San Francisco, California.
Right.
But almost immediately, his story takes this really interesting turn. He's adopted as a newborn.
Yeah, this adoption is a really, really critical point.
Okay.
I think as we sort of look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So his biological mother was Joanne Schiebel.
Okay.
Who at the time was this young grad student.
Right.
And his biological father, Abdul Fattah Jandali, a Syrian professor of political science.
And what's interesting is the circumstances surrounding, his birth and adoption, they were actually pretty complex, especially for that time.
Definitely.
What were some of those, like, societal factors at play?
Well, think about it. With the 1950s,
Yeah.
being unmarried and having a child.
Right.
Oh, it carried a huge social stigma.
Oh, yeah.
Joanne's father, in particular, was reportedly really against the relationship.
Yeah.
And so, given all these pressures,
right,
it was decided that Joanne would place her son for adoption.
That's so tough.
Oh, it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, you can only imagine.
So then that's where Paul and Clara Jobs come in.
Okay.
This couple from Mountain View, California. And they themselves couldn't have children. So Paul was a machinist and Clara was an accountant.
Right. Very blue-collar kind of background.
Yeah. And what's interesting is Joanne had this very specific condition for the adoption.
Okay. What was that?
She wanted her son to be raised by college graduates.
Oh, wow.
Which Paul and Clara weren't.
Right.
So how did that play out?
Well, that was kind of the sticking point.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul and Clara really wanted to adopt this baby.
Right.
But they hadn't gone to college. So they made a promise to Joanne that they would make sure that their adopted son would get a university education.
Wow, that's a big promise.
Huge promise. And that seems to have satisfied Joanne enough to let the adoption proceed.
Wow.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how that early promise, shaped the expectations around Steve's whole upbringing.
Yeah, it's like his life was kind of set on this trajectory.
In a way.
From the very beginning.
Yeah.
And then you think about him growing up in what would become Silicon Valley. I know, it's like almost destiny.
Oh, it's crazy.
Like it's meant to be.
Yeah.
And his adoptive father, Paul, played a huge role in his early exposure to electronics.
Right, because Paul was kind of a tinkerer, right?
Oh, totally. A very hands-on guy.
Yeah.
He brought home all these spare electronic components from work.
Yeah.
And for a young, curious mind like Steve's,
right,
that was like a window into this whole world.
Totally.
Of how things are made and how they work.
And there's that great story about Paul giving him that Heath kit.
Oh, yeah, the Heath kit.
So for anyone listening who's not familiar, what was a Heath kit?
Okay, so a Heath kit was this do-it-yourself electronics kit.
Okay.
So it came with all the parts instructions, but you had to assemble it yourself.
Wow.
And it wasn't just about ending up with, a working gadget.
Right.
It was about understanding the circuits,
the
connections, the principles of how it operated.
So it's like really hands-on learning.
Totally, yeah.
And I think you mentioned this before, but what's really interesting is that,
Paul just told him to figure it out.
I know. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. Like, what does that say about the kind of learning environment that he was in?
I think it fostered this real sense of self-reliance.
Yeah.
And problem solving. Like he wasn't being spoon-fed information, you know? It was about getting your hands dirty.
Yeah.
Experimenting, you know, learning through trial and error.
Yeah.
And I think this experience instilled in him this belief in the power of really understanding how things work.
Yeah.
You know, at their core. And that would later show up in his own designs. You know, his insistence on elegant and really well thought out products.
Yeah, so it's like those early lessons really kind of informed his whole approach later on.
I think so.
In life.
Yeah.
So now moving on to his early schooling.
Okay.
You know, your sources kind of paint a picture of a bright kid.
Yeah.
But maybe not like a traditional...
No, not the best big kid.
No, not the well-behaved kid.
Yeah. He was restless, easily bored.
You know, traditional classroom setting wasn't really, for him,
right.
super smart, but... You know, needed something a little different and definitely had a reputation as a bit of a troublemaker.
Yeah, like setting off an explosive under a teacher's chair.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic Steve Jobs story.
That's a little much.
Well, you know, it suggests a certain personality.
Yeah.
Testing boundaries.
Right.
Bored with the mundane, wants to see what happens.
Yeah.
When you push the limits.
Right.
Obviously not acceptable.
No.
You know.
But it speaks to something.
It hints at an active mind.
Right.
Not afraid to challenge things.
Yeah.
Even at a young age.
So then there's this turning point.
Okay.
With his 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Hill.
Okay, Mrs. Hill, what'd she do?
So she seems to have had a really big impact on him.
Oh, okay.
She recognized that he was smart despite the troublemaker stuff.
Right.
And instead of just punishing him, she figured out how to motivate him.
How'd she do that?
She used rewards, like candy and even money, for like completing his work.
That's amazing.
And doing well.
Interesting.
And it worked.
Really?
Yeah.
So like a personalized approach.
It's powerful.
Really is.
Because it shows that he wasn't like anti-learning.
Right.
He just needed the right kind of engagement.
Yeah, the right motivation.
Totally.
It's interesting how early on we see that, you know, needing things to be a certain way to really capture his attention.
Yeah, totally.
Which we see later on too.
So let's talk about his biological family.
Okay.
Because your sources say that he actually didn't know anything about them growing up.
That's right.
And he only met them as an adult.
Yeah. Later in life, he reconnected with his mother, Joanne.
Right.
And through that connection, learned more about Abdul Fattah.
And then there's this whole other thing with his sister, Mona Simpson.
Oh, yeah. So Joanne and Abdul Fattah had another child, Mona, after Steve was adopted.
Right.
And she became a novelist.
Wow.
And Steve and Mona actually developed a really close relationship.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's a nice part of the story.
But his relationship with his biological parents stayed kind of distant.
Yeah, it's a bit sad.
Yeah.
There's this one detail that I found so fascinating.
Yeah.
Abdul Fattah owned a coffee shop in the Bay Area.
Right.
And Steve actually went there early on in his Apple days.
What?
And neither of them knew they were father and son.
Oh, my God.
It wasn't until much later that Abdul Fattah found out.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
That's unbelievable.
It's wild.
It's like something out of a movie or something.
It's like a plot twist.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
But it's real life.
So when you think about it, like being adopted and the whole situation around it, and then finding out about his biological family under these crazy circumstances.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you wonder how that all affected him. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Like, how did that shape his identity?
Yeah.
You know?
Like who he thought he was.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's this quote from Steve where he says that being adopted made him feel a little separate.
A little separate, yeah.
And so how might that have influenced his development?
Yeah.
You know, his later ambition.
Yeah.
His drive.
Right.
It's a really compelling question.
Yeah, because if you're feeling like you don't quite belong in a traditional sense, like maybe that fuels this need to create your own world.
It could definitely contribute to that.
Yeah.
Like this need to prove himself.
Yeah, on his own terms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe it gave him this unique perspective.
Right.
Like a different way of seeing things.
Yeah. Like he wasn't bound by the traditional.
Yeah, maybe it freed him in a way.
All right.
To think differently.
Yeah. So like right from the get-go, his life was kind of marked by these major events.
Totally.
Like the adoption. growing up in what would become like the tech capital of the world.
Yeah.
Those early experiences with Paul, with the electronics, Mrs. Hill, and then finding out about his family. It really does seem like all these things were kind of woven into who he became.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Yeah.
Like it's all part of his story.
So as we kind of move into like his education and the other influences from when he was younger, it seems like it's really important to remember these early experiences.
Oh, for sure. They shaped his whole perspective.
Yeah.
And I think fueled his, famous, relentless pursuit of innovation.
Like his origin story is so essential to understanding everything that came after.
Absolutely.
So, looking back at these early years, it's pretty clear that Steve Jobs' story is so much more than just like a tech genius narrative.
Oh, for sure.
Like his beginnings were shaped by these deep,
profound
personal experiences.
Yeah.
And it seems like they played a big role.
Oh, huge role.
In who he became.
In making him the man he was.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is like how all these seemingly separate things, like the promise of a college education, the Heath kit, Mrs. Hill's teaching style, and then finding out he was adopted.
Right.
It's like they all came together to make this one-of-a-kind person.
They all converged to create this unique individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we go into his later youth and like the choices he made, we have to keep in mind these foundational things.
Totally.
Because they really did shape his worldview.
They shaped his worldview. They fueled his drive to innovate, to change the world.
Yeah, like these early years, they're not just like biographical details.
No, they're not just like a timeline.
Right.
They're essential to understanding the intensity, the vision, and even the complexities. That would define his whole career.
Yeah, and his impact.
Yeah, his lasting impact.
So it's really interesting to think that like from the very beginning, Steve Jobs' life was shaped by all these circumstances.
Yeah, totally.
And it makes you wonder how these early experiences kind of stay with a person.
Yeah.
Even as they go on to do all these amazing things.
Oh, for sure. I mean, how much of who we are is shaped by those early years?
Right.
And how do those experiences continue to resonate throughout our lives?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question to consider.
Yeah.
As we continue to look at all this material you've given me about Steve Jobs' life.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you find most interesting.
Yeah.
Or surprising.
Yeah.
As we learn more about him.
Totally. Okay, cool.
Let's do it.
So let's move on.